In the final months of World War II, as the Nazi regime crumbled and Soviet forces bore down on Berlin, a group of German scientists worked in a secret underground facility on something that would either be humanity's
Checkliste
greatest
bestätigt. Druck ist
technological
stabil.
breakthrough
Ventil
or
gesichert.
its most
Leitung ist
terrifying
gespannt.
weapon, a
Bolzen
project so
festgezogen.
classified that even today, nearly 80 years later, we are still not entirely sure what it was, and what we do know has become clouded by myth, legend, and deliberate suppression that destroyed careers and lives in ways most people have never heard about. This is the story of Die Glocke, the bell, and the scientists who gave everything to be elite only to have their entire legacies erased, their reputations shattered, and their fates consumed by one of the strangest and most disturbing chapters in military industrial history. A tale that begins not with the physical device itself, but with the peculiar ambitions of Nazi leadership and the desperate final gambit of a regime racing against time. When we think of Nazi weapons, we think of V-2 rockets, of jet fighters, of submarines that prowl the Atlantic, but Die Glocke represents something far
There,
more
that should complete
mysterious,
the
far more
circuit.
unsettling,
Now
because
for
it
the ground
occupies that
connection.
strange intersection between documented
No,
history
this can't
and
be true.
conspiratorial rumor,
The
between
implications are
what we can
staggering. I
verify
love
and what has
this
been so
immediately.
thoroughly buried that perhaps we'll never know the complete truth. The story emerges primarily from the post-war testimonies of Igor Witkowski, a police journalist who claims to have interviewed three separate individuals who worked
You
on
can't
or
hide the
knew
truth
about the
from
project.
us. No
People
matter
who
what
had
it convenes.
survived the war
We
and
know what
carried the
you've
weight
done.
of this knowledge for
Gentlemen, the
decades. Their
prototype is
voices
unstable. We must
eventually
act now.
translated into a
Our state.
narrative so
Catastrophic. We need to
extraordinary
evacuate
that serious
immediately.
historians
As you
dismissed
can
it
see from these
outright,
trends, the
while
data
others
converges
became
here.
obsessed
This
with proving
intersection is
every
crucial for
detail.
our
What
analysis.
makes Die Glocke so compelling and so tragic is not just the mystery of the object itself, whether it was a revolutionary technology, a weapons platform, or perhaps something in the realm of theoretical physics that the Nazis believed could change the course of the war, but rather what happened to the men who worked on it, how their lives were systematically dismantled in the years following the war, how they were haunted by the work they'd done, and how several of them died under circumstances that were either remarkably convenient for those who wanted the project forgotten or genuinely suspicious depending on which account you believe. The scientists involved were not mindless servants of evil, though some of them certainly had ties to the Nazi regime and benefited from its power structure. Many were idealists, brilliant minds who believed they were working on projects that could advance human knowledge and only later realized the true military purpose and dark implications of what they had been creating in those underground bunkers. The psychological and emotional toll this took on these men became the actual dark side of the Glock. Not necessarily what the device did, but what the project did to the people who built it. How it poisoned their post war lives, how they were simultaneously hunted by intelligence agencies from multiple nations, threatened by people who wanted the project to remain secret, and marginalized by the scientific community that refused to take their claims seriously. To understand this fully, we need to go back to the context of Nazi Germany's desperate situation in 1944 and 1945, when it became clear that conventional weapons could not win the war. When Hitler and his regime became increasingly willing to pursue radical technological solutions, when enormous resources were funneled into exotic weapons programs in the hopes that some miracle weapon could reverse Germany's military fortunes. The Nazis had already invested massively in advanced rocket technology under Wernher von Braun, and they had experimental aircraft programs pushing the boundaries of what was possible in aviation. But by 1944, these programs, while impressive, could not compete with the overwhelming industrial capacity and manpower that the Allies had marshaled. It was in this context, according to the testimonies that would later emerge, that a secret program was established to explore more radical possibilities, technologies so advanced and so unconventional that they operated almost outside the bounds of what was scientifically considered possible at the time. The project, codenamed Die Glocke or sometimes referred to by other codenames in different intelligence files, allegedly focused on developing some kind of device that could manipulate gravitational forces, create electromagnetic fields of unprecedented strength, or possibly even harness the power of atomic energy in some controlled form, though the exact nature of the project remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. Primarily because so many records were destroyed, so many participants either died under suspicious circumstances or simply refused to speak about their work until long after their contribution could have been studied. The facility where this work supposedly took place was located in the Sudeten Mountains in what is now the Czech Republic in a complex of underground bunkers that had been expanded specifically for this purpose, accessible only to those with the highest clearance, where teams of physicists, engineers, and military scientists work in strict compartmentalization, meaning that most of the people involved only knew their small piece of the puzzle and not the larger picture of what was being constructed. What made this project different from other Nazi weapons programs was its theoretical foundation. It wasn't simply trying to build a better bomb or a faster plane, but rather to weaponize or exploit some principle of physics that the Nazis believed could turn the tide of the war. Something that touched on quantum mechanics, on the nature of reality itself, on possibilities that contemporary mainstream science had not yet explored or even considered seriously. The primary scientist associated with the project, according to the testimonies, was a physicist named SS Obersturmbannführer Dr. Erich Schumann, who had connections both to the Wehrmacht and to Nazi scientific circles, and who was interested in electromagnetic phenomena and exotic weapons concepts, someone who had the air of Nazi leadership and the resources to pursue ideas that other scientists would have been laughed at for suggesting. Schumann brought together a team of brilliant minds, some of them willing participants in the Nazi regime, others who were coerced or threatened into participation, including engineers and physicists whose names and faces have largely been erased from the historical record. People whose contributions were so classified that even their families sometimes didn't know the full extent of what they had been doing during the war. The project apparently made significant progress, or so the testimonies claim, reaching some kind of operational stage in 1944 and 1945, with several alleged test runs conducted in a remote area near the facility, tests that, according to some accounts, produced extraordinary results. Strange electromagnetic phenomena, radiation signatures that contaminated the test site, physical effects that shouldn't have been possible according to conventional physics, all recorded in documents that would later vanish. The testimonies are vague on the exact technological specifications, partly because the people recounting them decades later had been deliberately kept compartmentalized from full knowledge, and partly because describing such advanced and classified work in detail would have been dangerous for them even after the war had ended. When the Soviet army advanced into the region and the Nazis realized that the project site would soon be overrun, the decision was apparently made to either relocate the project, destroy all evidence of it, or move it somewhere beyond Soviet reach. And this is where the story becomes even more complicated, because different testimonies suggest different outcomes. And some
I
of the
can't
people
believe this
involved
is
in the
happening.
project apparently
This changes
scattered to
everything
different
we do.
destinations, seeking safety from the advancing Soviets and from the American and British forces who were also hunting for advanced German technology. Some accounts suggest that the main equipment and possibly some key personnel were moved to a secret location within German territory, or even to a Nazi redoubt in the Bavarian Alps or in Austria, where they presumably continued some form of work during the final chaos of the war, though evidence for this is largely anecdotal and based on the testimonies of people who are themselves not present for all events. The truly dark side of Die Glocke emerges in what happened next, in the years after the war ended and the scientists dispersed, some captured by the Americans, others by the Soviets, still others managing to disappear into the confusion of post-war Europe, where millions of people were displaced and records were chaotic at best. Those who were captured by the Soviets faced a particularly grim fate. Many were interrogated about their work, forced to reveal what they knew about the project, and then disappeared into the Soviet system, either executed, imprisoned in labor camps, or simply never heard from again, their knowledge literally dying with them as Stalin's regime absorbed what it could and buried the rest. Those captured by the Americans had a somewhat different experience. They were interrogated, their knowledge was extracted, and then many of them were either prosecuted for their roles in the Nazi regime, or in some cases they were quietly protected and sometimes even rehired to continue their research. As the United States had its own interest in advanced weapons technology and was willing to overlook past Nazi affiliations if the knowledge was valuable enough, but for those scientists who survived the war and tried to rebuild their lives, who tried to return to legitimate academic work or to simply fade into obscurity, The project followed them like a curse, a secret that poisoned their existence. A knowledge that they carried but could never fully share because doing so would either expose them to accusations of war crimes, make them targets for intelligence agencies who wanted the project to remain secret, or result in them being dismissed as delusional fraudsters trying to claim credit for impossible achievements. Several of the scientists allegedly involved in or connected to the project died under circumstances that, while not necessarily probably suspicious, nonetheless strike historians as unusual, deaths that came at convenient times for those who wanted the project forgotten, deaths by accident, illness, or in a few cases, apparent suicide, deaths that coincided with increased pressure from intelligence agencies or with the scientists preparing to make public statements about their work. The psychological toll this took was immense. These were men who had been trained to be precise, to be rational, to be skeptical, and yet they possessed knowledge that they had no way to prove, that the mainstream scientific community would reject, that they could only partially share with a handful of people they trusted, because full disclosure would mean legal jeopardy, professional annihilation, and possibly physical danger. Some of them became reclusive, paranoid, convinced that they were being watched, and whether they actually were being watched, or whether the trauma of the war and the stress of carrying this secret had affected their mental state, it's impossible now to say with certainty, but the pattern is consistent across multiple testimonies. The idea that these scientists became isolated, emotionally fractured people, cut off from normal academic and professional lives because of what they knew and could not speak about. Igor Witkowski's book, Pravda o Wunderwaffe, published in Polish and later translated to English as Secrets of the German War Machine, presented these testimonies and attempted to reconstruct what Die Glocke might have been based on the fragmentary information that the survivors had provided. And while the book generated significant interest, it also generated massive skepticism from mainstream historians and scientists, many of whom dismissed the entire project as either a Nazi hoax, a post war fabrication, or at best, a theoretical project that never progressed beyond the drawing board. But here's where the story becomes truly intriguing. Because even if Die Glocke as a functioning weapon or technology never actually existed, the psychological and emotional toll on the scientists who were involved in or believed to be involved in the project was absolutely real, and the suppression of information about what they knew, the way their testimonies were discredited, the way they were systematically isolated and marginalized, this was all very real and very damaging. The scientific establishment's response to these testimonies was particularly harsh because accepting that something like Die Glocke might have existed or might have been attempted would have required revising the historical narrative of World War II, and the development of advanced technology would have meant acknowledging that the Nazis had pursued scientific directions that contemporary mainstream science had dismissed as impossible, and would have potentially elevated the reputation of Nazi science in ways that most historians and scientists were deeply uncomfortable with. So instead, the official response became one of complete dismissal. The scientists who claimed knowledge of the project were dismissed as unreliable witnesses, their accounts were treated as fabrications or delusions, and the entire subject was pushed to the margins, relegated to the realm of conspiracy theory and pseudoscience, which had the convenient effect of making anyone who took the testimonies seriously look foolish. What's particularly tragic about this is that even if some or all of the testimonies about Diavloko's technical capabilities were exaggerated or completely false, the human suffering that resulted from the secrecy, the compartmentalization, the official dismissal, and the psychological pressure was entirely real and entirely documented. Several of the men involved became alcoholics. Their health deteriorated, their relationships with family members suffered, they became isolated within the scientific community that had once been their entire world, and in some cases they died relatively young, worn down by the stress and secrecy and the knowledge that the work they had done was either incomprehensible to the world or deliberately suppressed. The Allies' own intelligence agencies seemed to develop an obsessive interest in the project. Both the Americans and the British, and certainly the Soviets, invested significant resources into finding information about Die Glocke, which is itself suspicious if the project was truly as fantastical and impossible as mainstream historians claim it was. Why would professional intelligence agencies dedicate resources to investigating something they believe to be complete nonsense. The very fact that multiple nations' intelligence services appear to take the project seriously suggests that at minimum something was happening in those underground bunkers, something that was significant enough to warrant investigation. Even if that something bore no resemblance to the various theories that have since emerged about what it might have been. There's also the matter of the Nazi Wunderwaffe program more broadly. We know that the Nazis did pursue exotic weapons concepts, did invest in advanced research into areas that seemed unlikely to produce results, and did in fact develop technologies that were surprisingly advanced for their time. So it's not entirely implausible that something like a concentrated effort to weaponize exotic physics could have existed within that broader framework. The compartmentalization and secrecy that characterized Nazi weapons programs was legendary. The Allies were often shocked at the advanced state of German technology when they discovered it after the war. We suggest that there were aspects of Nazi research that remained completely hidden from Allied intelligence until the very end, so the possibility that something like Die Glocke existed and remained unknown until post-war investigations seems within the realm of plausibility. What we can say with relative certainty is that something happened in those underground facilities, something involving advanced research into electromagnetic phenomena or exotic physics or weapons applications of theoretical science, something that was significant enough to warrant the testimonies of multiple surviving scientists, something that the post-war intelligence establishment found interesting enough to investigate, and something that the mainstream scientific community found threatening enough to dismiss entirely and marginalize anyone who took it seriously. Whether Die Glocke was a functional device, a theoretical project that never reached fruition, an attempt at harnessing atomic energy, a weapon based on electromagnetic manipulation, or something else entirely remains unknown and perhaps unknowable, lost to the destruction of records, the deaths of witnesses, and the deliberate suppression of information by multiple governments. But what we can say with absolute certainty is that the project had a devastating impact on the men involved, on their lives, their mental health, their relationships, their careers, and in some cases on the circumstances of their deaths, and that this human toll, this destruction of people's lives and sanity in service of secrecy and the protection of military industrial interests, this is the real dark side of Die Glocke. The tragedy is that we may never know the complete truth about what the device was or what it could do, but we know very well what the project did to the people who worked on it. It destroyed their credibility, isolated them from the scientific community, poisoned their remaining years with stress and paranoia, and ensured that their contributions to history, whatever they might have been, would be dismissed and forgotten. In the end, the real power of Die Glocke wasn't in whatever technology it might have represented, but rather in the way it damaged human lives, in how it was used as a tool of suppression and control, in how people who knew about it were systematically marginalized and silenced, and in how the very existence of the secrecy became more powerful than the truth of what was being hidden. This is a story about the costs of secrecy, about what happens to human beings when they carry knowledge they cannot share, about the intersection of science and military power, and about how institutions can protect themselves by discrediting and destroying the people who threaten to reveal uncomfortable truths. As we look back on the history of the 20th century, at the way scientific advancement became increasingly bound up with military and governmental power, Die Glocke stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of compartmentalization, about what happens when brilliant minds are put to work in service of destructive ends and then abandoned and discredited when the war ends, and about the human cost of classified research and military secrets. The scientists involved are mostly gone now, their testimonies aging and becoming less credible with each passing year, their original claims made harder to verify or disprove, and the most likely scenario is that we will never know the complete truth about what Die Glocke was or what the project achieved, which may be exactly what the institutions that suppressed it wanted all along. Not necessarily to protect a world changing technology from being revealed, but to protect themselves from having to answer uncomfortable questions about what they knew, when they knew it, and why they spent so much effort making sure that certain knowledge remained buried. So, I want to know what you thought of this exploration into one of history's deepest mysteries, the tragic story of the scientists who built something that the world wasn't ready to know about, and the dark consequences that followed their involvement with the Glocke, and the pursuit of knowledge that perhaps should have remained unknown, or perhaps should have been brought fully into the light decades ago, so that the men involved could have found peace instead of spending the rest of their lives haunted by secrets they couldn't tell and work they couldn't fully explain or defend. If you enjoyed this journey through one of World War II's strangest and most tragic chapters, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Die Glocke existed? Was it truly a technological marvel, or was it all elaborate hoax? What do you think happened to the scientists who built it, and what would you want historians to uncover about this project if more documentation ever surfaced? Thank you so much for watching this exploration of one of history's greatest mysteries, and I hope to see you in the next video where we'll investigate another strange and haunting chapter from the past.